After my father passed away, my mother quickly declared she'd finally found a man who was worthy of her and then forced me to leave the house. Reflecting on what my grandfather had told me, I recalled the last time I saw my father. He looked frail, a shadow of his former self, with cancer having drained his strength. I was by his side every day, doing everything I could to keep him comfortable. He'd been my hero, the solid anchor in our family, the one we could always depend on. Losing him felt like losing part of myself, and the days after his funeral blurred together in a haze of sorrow and disbelief. Life without him seemed unimaginable. But just when I thought the pain couldn't get worse, my mother, Laura, shattered what was left of my sense of stability. Only a week after the funeral, she called me into the living room, her expression strange and unreadable. I assumed she wanted to discuss our plans, maybe go through some of Dad's things. Instead, she introduced me to a man named Mark. "This is Mark," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "We're engaged." Her words hung heavily in the air, almost incomprehensible. Engaged? I looked between her and Mark, who stood beside her with a smug look on his face. He wore an expensive suit, his watch shining under the light, and something about him made my skin crawl. My father had barely been gone, yet here she was, flaunting this stranger in our home. "You're getting married," I finally managed to say, struggling to make sense of it. "Yes, Ethan," she replied, as if I was being unreasonable. "We've been together for 6 months. I didn't tell you earlier because I didn't think you'd understand while your father was still alive." She was right. I didn't understand. I couldn't grasp how she could have been seeing someone else while my father was dying, or how she could stand there so casually talking about marriage as if Dad's body wasn't still fresh in the grave. "So you just moved on?" I asked, barely containing my anger. The betrayal cut deep. While Dad was suffering, you were with him. Mark cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to take control of the situation. "Listen, Ethan," he began in a condescending tone, "your mother and I are in love. Sometimes things happen that we can't control. We didn't plan for it to happen like this, but here we are." I clenched my fists, feeling every fiber of my being urging me to tell them both off. But before I could speak, my mother's next words hit me like a slap. "Ethan, I need you to leave," she said, her tone cold and resolute. "Mark and I want a fresh start. You're a reminder of the past, of my life with Robert. I can't have that around us." I stared at her, unable to process her words. "You're kicking me out," my voice cracked, unable to mask the hurt. "You're really making me leave my own home." "It's not like that, Ethan," she said, sounding irritated. "I've given you some money. There's enough in your account to help you get started somewhere new. You're young, you'll be fine." I wanted to scream, to tell her that money was the last thing on my mind and that I couldn't believe she was choosing this man over her own son. But the words wouldn't come. I stood there, feeling numb, as she folded her arms, daring me to challenge her decision. "Fine," I finally said, my voice hollow. "If you want me gone, I'll go. But don't expect me to come running back when this falls apart." She didn't respond, and in that moment, I felt the last bit of our bond dissolve. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. Packing my things felt surreal. I moved through the house in a daze, throwing clothes and belongings into a duffel bag. My room, which had once felt safe, was now a reminder of a family that had been shattered. As I left, I glanced back, seeing her and Mark standing in the doorway with unreadable expressions. I turned away, walking down the driveway, knowing that I could never go back. My mother had made it clear that I was no longer welcome, no longer part of her new life. With only a few $1,000s and nowhere to go, I did the only thing I could think of. I called my grandparents. George and Helen had always been there for me, providing the love and support that my parents hadn't. When I told them what happened, there was a long silence before Grandpa George spoke, his voice thick with barely controlled anger. "Come over, Ethan," he said. "You're always welcome here. We'll figure this out together." Their home was a modest, cozy place on the edge of town, filled with the warmth and love I'd been missing. They greeted me at the door with open arms, pulling me into a hug that I hadn't realized I needed so badly. The weight of the past days hit me fully, the shock and betrayal washing over me. Grandma Helen led me to the living room, where they listened as I recounted everything. Grandpa's anger was clear, his jaw clenched as I spoke, while Grandma quietly held my hand, her trembling fingers a silent testament to her own distress. "How could she do that?" Grandpa finally said, his voice low with rage. "After everything your father went through, after all you did for him, to throw you out like that, it's unforgivable." "I don't know," I replied, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. "It's like she's a different person now." Grandma shook her head, her expression filled with sorrow. "She's made her choice, Ethan. And if that's the life she wants, so be it. But you're not alone. You have us, and we'll help you through this." We spent hours talking, going over my options and trying to make sense of the chaos my life had become. Grandpa offered to help me find somewhere to live, even suggesting I could stay with them as long as I needed. It was a relief, a lifeline I hadn't anticipated but desperately needed. That night, lying in the guest room, I felt a mixture of anger and grief churning within me. I thought about my father, the promises he'd made, and the family we were meant to be. I thought about my mother, the woman who had once been my world, who had now cast me aside without hesitation. And I thought about Mark, the man who had somehow slithered into her life, into mine, with no regard for the wreckage he'd caused. I knew I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't make my mother care, or undo the choices she'd made. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I made a vow to myself I would get through this, rebuild, and prove that I didn't need her or anyone else to define my worth. The days that followed were an emotional whirlwind. I spent hours with Grandpa, scanning job listings and weighing my options. He offered financial help, but I declined. I wanted to handle this myself, to show that I could stand on my own. With his guidance, I landed a part-time job at a local bookstore, a small step toward independence that felt both intimidating and empowering. Yet even as I began to rebuild, I couldn't shake the bitterness, the gnawing sense of betrayal. I thought about my mother, about the life she was forging with Mark, and I couldn't understand how she could so easily discard my father's memory and mine, as if we had never mattered. It wasn't long before I heard she was getting married. The wedding was set for the following month, planned as a grand event flaunting wealth and status. I wasn't invited. I found out through an old friend who heard about it through the grapevine. She hadn't even told me herself, as though I were already forgotten, erased from her new life. That night, I felt crushed by the weight of her betrayal. I thought about calling her, about demanding an explanation, confronting her with all the anger and hurt that had built up inside me. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. She had made her choice, and nothing I could say would alter her path. Instead, I threw myself into work, determined to build a life that was solely mine. My grandparents' unwavering support became a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes felt. They helped me find a small apartment, humble but enough to start over. I saved every penny I earned, resolved to create a future I could be proud of, a future that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. The day I found out about the inheritance felt surreal, like a sudden gust that changes everything in a moment. After breakfast, Grandpa George and Grandma Helen sat me down, their faces serious, like they were about to share something that could reshape my entire world. The way they exchanged glances told me this wouldn't be an ordinary conversation. "Ethan," Grandpa began, his voice calm but steady, "there's something we need to tell you about your father's estate. I had assumed Dad hadn't left much. He had been sick for a long time, and we weren't a family who talked much about money. I figured any savings had been drained by medical expenses. So when Grandpa told me my father had left behind $500,000, I almost laughed, thinking it had to be a mistake. $500,000, I repeated, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner? Grandma reached over, placing a hand on mine. "Because your mother didn't want you to know," she said softly. "We only found out recently ourselves. We asked her after the funeral, but she insisted there was nothing left. We did some digging and found the accounts." A surge of anger rushed through me, hot and fast. Of course, Laura had kept it hidden. She had thrown me out, kept me in the dark, and now I learned she'd concealed my father's legacy from me. The money he'd left was supposed to be mine, a part of him meant to support me. And she'd hidden it all while she went on to start a new life with Mark. "She's been hiding it from me," I said, feeling the reality sink in. "She kept this from me while she was building a life with him." Grandpa nodded, his expression grim. That's why we're telling you now. We want to help you fight for what's rightfully yours. Your father left that money for you, and she had no right to keep it hidden. My grandparents had always been well-connected, with a family reputation that spanned generations. If anyone could help me navigate this, it was them. Grandpa didn't waste any time. He had connections to some of the top lawyers in town, and within days he'd arranged a meeting with Mr. Collins, an old friend and one of the sharpest legal minds around. Mr. Collins was a no-nonsense man with a focused, calm demeanor that inspired confidence. He listened carefully as we laid out the situation, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. "So let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. "Your father left you an inheritance of $500,000, and Laura has been withholding it from you." I nodded, fists clenched as my anger resurfaced. Yes, she never told me about it. I only found out because my grandparents uncovered the accounts. Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with Laura's actions. "I've handled cases like this before," he said. "If she's been actively hiding your inheritance, we have grounds to challenge her control over the estate. We'll need to dig into the details, of course, but I'm confident we can uncover the truth." As we discussed the case, I brought up Mark, the man who had swept into our lives and shattered what was left of our family. Mr. Collins seemed especially interested, his expression sharpening as he jotted down a few notes. "Tell me more about Mark," he said, his gaze intense. I confessed I didn't know much about his background, but something about him always seemed wrong, too smooth, too calculated. I never trusted him. Mr. Collins leaned in, his pen ready over his notepad. "I'll investigate," he promised. "If Mark has any hidden secrets, we'll uncover them." People like him usually leave a trail. Just a few days later, Mr. Collins called us back to his office. He had been busy, and the files on his desk suggested he had found more than I had expected. He got right to the point with the information he had gathered. "Mark has a history." He began in a factual tone, a history that isn't exactly honorable. He was part of a fraudulent investment scheme a few years ago. Several people lost their savings, but he avoided prison by paying a large fine. From what I see, he's moved from one scheme to the next, likely searching for easy victims. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My suspicions were confirmed. He was a fraud, a con artist who had probably seen an opportunity with my mother and taken it without hesitation. "Does Laura know about this?" I asked, my mind racing with the implications. Mr. Collins shook his head. "Hard to say, but given his past, it's unlikely he was upfront about it. People like him know how to hide who they really are. She probably has no clue about his true nature." Grandpa clenched his fists, his face set in determination. "We have to act. We can't let him take advantage of Ethan or Laura. For that matter," Mr. Collins nodded. "We have options. With this information, we can challenge her control over the estate. If she hid Ethan's inheritance and is associating with someone with Mark's reputation, it strengthens our case. But we'll need to be cautious. Mark might retaliate if he feels threatened. And people like him don't give up easily." We spent the next few hours developing a plan, going over the steps we'd take to expose Mark's history and reclaim my inheritance. Mr. Collins would start by filing a petition against Laura's control over the estate, noting her concealment of my inheritance and association with a known fraudster. He'd also initiate a background check on Mark to gather as much evidence as possible to bolster our case. As we left the office, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, yes, but also relief and a sense of vindication. For the first time since all this started, I felt I had a real chance to fight, like I wasn't just a victim of forces beyond my control. With Grandpa, Grandma, and Mr. Collins on my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. The following week was a blur of meetings and paperwork. Mr. Collins worked tirelessly, gathering documents, compiling evidence, and preparing our case. He showed us records of Mark's past, evidence of the fraudulent schemes he had been involved in, and the lawsuits filed against him. It was a sordid history that painted a clear picture of a man who thrived on deception and manipulation. But even as we prepared, I couldn't help but worry. Mark wasn't the type to back down easily, and if he felt cornered, there was no telling what he might do. I didn't trust him, and the thought of him being part of my mother's life, or potentially having control over my father's legacy, filled me with dread. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the latest documents with Grandpa, I received a message from Laura. It was short, just a single line that sent a chill down my spine. "We need to talk. Come to the house tomorrow." I showed it to Grandpa, who read it with a frown. "She probably knows we're contesting the estate," he said. "She's probably trying to get ahead of this, to see if she can talk you out of it." I nodded, my mind running through the possibilities. "I'll go," I said, feeling a wave of determination. "But I won't let her intimidate me. She's the one who's been lying, not me." The next day, I made my way back to the house, the place that had once been my home but now felt like enemy territory. As I approached the front door, I steadied myself, ready for whatever waited inside. Laura was in the living room, and Mark was nowhere to be seen. She looked different, older, somehow, with her face drawn and weary, yet a new hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Ethan," she began, her tone sharp and formal, "I know what you're trying to do, and I'm telling you to stop. Mark and I have plans, and you're not going to ruin them." I stared at her, a mix of disbelief and anger flooding through me. "Plans? You mean hiding my inheritance? Lying to me about everything? I know what Mark is, Mom. I know he's a fraud, and he's using you. How can you not see that?" She flinched, but her expression stayed defiant. "Mark loves me, Ethan. He's been there for me when you haven't. You're just bitter because things didn't go the way you wanted. But this is my life, and you have no right to interfere." "Dad left that money for me," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "It was his legacy, and you've hidden it from me. You have no right to take that away, and I won't let you." She looked away, her facade cracking for a moment. I thought I saw a flash of regret, a glimpse of something human beneath her mask, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, empty expression. "You don't understand, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You never did. But you're right about one thing: I can't stop you. Do what you have to, but don't expect any sympathy from me." With that, she turned away, leaving me standing there, a blend of anger and sadness welling up inside me. I knew there was no going back, no repairing the damage that had been done, but I also knew I couldn't let her or Mark destroy what my father had left for me. I had a responsibility to protect his legacy, to honor the man who had meant everything to me. As I left the house, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. A hardened resolve replaced any lingering doubts and fears. With Grandpa, Grandma, and Mr. Collins supporting me, I felt ready to face whatever was coming. Mark might be a swindler, a con artist who believed he could trick his way into our lives, but he had underestimated us. As long as I was breathing, I would fight to ensure he never laid a finger on anything that didn't rightfully belong to him. This battle was about more than just money. It was about respect, family, and standing up for what was right. No matter how long it took, I was prepared for the struggle ahead. Without wasting time, armed with Mr. Collins' findings, I called Laura to set up a meeting. She agreed, probably thinking she could convince me to abandon my pursuit of the inheritance. She had no idea what revelations I was about to share. The very next morning, I arrived at the house and found Laura waiting in the living room, her face tense but expectant. I didn't beat around the bush. "Mom, I know about the inheritance," I said steadily. "I know Dad left $500,000, and I know you've kept it hidden from me." She blinked, taken aback, but quickly composed herself, her face shifting into a look of practiced neutrality. "I don't know where you're getting this idea, Ethan," she replied, "but there is no hidden inheritance. I have no money from your father. He left us with nothing." I placed the documents from Mr. Collins on the coffee table between us. "I have proof," I said, watching her eyes scan the papers, bank statements, account numbers. It was all there. "And I also know about Mark's criminal history, the fraud, the schemes. Did you know about that, or has he kept you in the dark too?" Her face flushed, and her composure started to waver. This is absurd," she stammered. "Mark explained everything to me. Those charges were just misunderstandings. He's a good man, and he's been good to me." There was desperation in her tone, a hint of defensiveness as she scrambled for explanations. "You can't honestly believe he's using you, Mom. He has a history of this with other people. Do you really think he loves you? He's only after the money, and he won't care what happens to you once he gets it." Before she could respond, Mark entered the room, his gaze moving between us as he absorbed the situation. He had overheard enough to understand what was going on. Moving to stand beside Laura, he placed a protective arm around her, as if his presence alone could shield her from the truth. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "You seem quite agitated, Ethan. Maybe you're simply misunderstanding the situation." "Not at all," I replied firmly. "I'm here to claim what's rightfully mine, and I'm not leaving until it's settled. I know about your history, Mark, the fraud, the scams. You won't fool me." He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You've got some spirit, I'll give you that. But I'm not sure you fully understand what you're up against." He reached into his pocket, pulled out an envelope, and tossed it onto the table. "Here's $50,000. Take it and walk away. Keep quiet, and we'll all go on as if none of this ever happened." I glanced at the envelope, feeling a wave of disgust. "You think you can just buy me off?" I shot back. "This isn't about the money, it's about doing what's right. You don't belong here, and I won't let you ruin what's left of our family." His eyes narrowed, and I saw the shift in his expression to something cold and calculating, sending a chill through me. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You'd better think carefully about your choices, Ethan. I don't take kindly to threats, and I won't let you or anyone else tear down what I've built here. Take the money or face the consequences." I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "You don't scare me, Mark. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not taking your bribe. I have everything I need to expose you, and that's exactly what I'll do." Straightening, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. "Fine, have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you with that." He stormed out, leaving Laura looking stunned and defeated. I took a deep breath, a strange mix of relief and tension washing over me. The confrontation was over, but I knew this was just the beginning. I would need to go further to reveal everything. The following day, I gathered the family and a few close friends at my grandparents' house, calling a meeting that would unsettle everyone. Grandpa and Grandma had been incredibly supportive, reaching out to family members with hints that there were pressing matters to discuss, truths that needed to be brought to light. By the time everyone arrived, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and unease. As the room filled with familiar faces, I could see the curiosity in their eyes, the way they glanced at one another, silently wondering what was about to unfold. I stood at the front, waiting until the murmurs subsided before I began. "Thank you all for coming," I started, looking around the room and meeting each person's gaze. "I know you're all probably wondering why I've called you here. There are things about my father's estate, things that have happened since he passed, that you all deserve to know. This is about our family, our legacy, and I can't keep it to myself any longer." Laura and Mark sat together near the back, their faces tense. Mark looked as if he was ready to bolt, while Laura's expression was a mixture of anger and fear. I took a deep breath and laid everything out: the discovery of the hidden inheritance, my confrontation with Laura, the bribe Mark had offered, and finally, the evidence of Mark's criminal history. At first, I kept my voice steady as I spoke, but there was no more room for doubt. Mark had a history of fraud, of conning people out of their money, and he'd been keeping this hidden from everyone here, intending to get control of my father's estate. The room filled with gasps and shocked whispers, family members exchanging stunned looks, some of them looking at Laura with expressions of hurt and betrayal. I could see my words sinking in, the truth settling on their faces as they realized they'd been deceived and manipulated by the people they had trusted most. Mark rose to his feet, trying to appear indignant. "This is all ridiculous," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Ethan is making baseless accusations, trying to create problems because things didn't go his way. You all know me, I'm an honest man. This is just a smear campaign." I turned to Mr. Collins, who was seated nearby, and he stood up, holding a pile of documents. "Actually, Mark," he replied calmly, "we have plenty of evidence to support Ethan's claims. These are records from your prior fraud cases, court documents, witness statements from victims. The truth is right here in black and white." Mark's face turned pale, and I saw fear creeping into his expression as he realized his lies had finally caught up with him. He glanced around the room as if searching for anyone who might support him, but no one moved. Everyone was watching him with a mix of anger and disappointment, their trust shattered by the revelations just laid out. Laura looked down, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. It was clear she was struggling to absorb everything, the reality of the situation closing in as her decisions weighed down on her. She didn't even try to defend him. She stayed silent as the heavy silence in the room grew. "This is your fault, isn't it?" Mark hissed at her, his voice low and filled with venom. "You could never keep your mouth shut. This is all falling apart because of you." Laura lifted her gaze, her eyes glistening with tears, but she said nothing. For once, it seemed she had no fight left, no defenses to hide behind. She had thrown her lot in with a con artist, and now she was facing the consequences. The family members began speaking up, their voices a chorus of disbelief and anger. Aunt Susan, who had always been close to my mother, shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks as she looked at Laura. "How could you do this, Laura?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After everything Robert did for you, after all the years we've known each other, how could you let this man come between us?" Laura looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I felt a pang of pity for her. Despite everything, she had made her choices, and now she was paying for them, with no way to undo the damage done. Realizing his chances of saving face were slipping, Mark turned on his heel and stormed out, his footsteps echoing through the hall. No one moved to stop him. The door slammed shut behind him, and I felt a surge of relief, a victory I hadn't expected. He was gone, his grip on our family shattered in a single moment. Laura sat there alone and defeated, bearing the weight of her choices while the family looked on. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow watching her, knowing this marked the end of an era, the end of the family I had once known. After the public humiliation and exposure of his fraud, Mark had had enough. He packed what little he could carry and left town, abandoning Laura to face the fallout alone. His exit was abrupt but hardly surprising. Men like him thrived on lies and vanished as soon as they were exposed. Once he was gone, things moved quickly. With the whole community now aware of the lies and betrayal, the support for me and my grandparents was overwhelming. People reached out, offering help, kind words, and making it clear that they were behind us. The town had turned against Laura. Where there had once been sympathy, there was now anger and disappointment. With Mr. Collins leading the effort, we took legal action to reclaim the house and the inheritance my father had left for me. Our case was strong, bolstered by the evidence we had on Mark's fraudulent activities and Laura's attempts to hide my inheritance. Laura fought back initially, but it was evident she didn't have much of a case. Isolated, without Mark's influence or support, her claims quickly crumbled under scrutiny. The court proceedings, though lengthy, ultimately worked in our favor. Mr. Collins presented our case with precision, detailing every aspect of Mark's involvement, the fraud, the lies, and Laura's role in trying to cover up my inheritance. He argued that her efforts to hide the inheritance had been an act of bad faith, one that denied me my rightful place in the estate and disrespected my father's wishes. As the judge examined the evidence, I saw the gravity of the situation beginning to sink in for Laura. She sat there, her face drained of color, her shoulders slumped. Gone was the confident woman who had tried to cast me aside. Now she was laid bare, forced to confront the consequences of her actions. Finally, the decision came. The judge awarded us full control over the estate, granting me ownership of the house and the inheritance. It was a hard-won victory, one that my grandparents and I had fought tirelessly for. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt an immense sense of relief and a feeling of justice served. The house, my father's legacy, was back with the family, where it belonged. Returning to the house was bittersweet. The place was stained with memories of betrayal, yet it also held the presence of my father, traces of the life he had built for us. I knew I couldn't leave it as it was. It needed to be revived, to be given a new beginning. Determined to honor his memory, I used part of the inheritance to plan renovations. I enlisted the help of local artisans, people who had known my father, people who understood the importance of the house and what it meant to me. We tore down the walls, ripped up the floors, and rebuilt everything bit by bit. The work was slow and careful, but each change, each improvement, felt like reclaiming a piece of what had been lost. During the renovation, I stumbled upon old family photos hidden in forgotten corners, pictures of my father smiling, laughing, living a life that now felt far away. I kept these photos, determined to bring them back, to revive the warmth and love that had once filled the house. With every nail hammered, every wall repainted, I felt a renewed connection to the past that gave me strength. While we worked on the renovations, Laura tried to reconnect. She showed up at the house one day, looking unsure, her usual confidence replaced with a trace of vulnerability. I noticed her through the window before she knocked, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the porch. When I opened the door, I saw hesitation in her eyes, a hint of regret that almost seemed sincere. "Ethan," she started, her voice gentle, almost pleading, "I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've hurt you. I just I just want a chance to explain." I stood quietly, letting her words sink in. She spoke of how lost she'd felt after Dad passed, how she had clung to Mark as a way to numb the pain. She admitted she was wrong, that she'd let desperation blind her, driven by a need she couldn't quite define. But as she talked, I felt no sympathy, no desire to forgive. The pain she caused was too deep, the betrayal too fresh. She had chosen Mark over me, had chosen to erase the family we once had, and there was no way to undo that. "I can't do this, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "You made your choice, and I've made mine. This house, this inheritance, it's all I have left of Dad, and I won't let you take that away from me. I'm moving forward, with or without you." Her face dropped, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes, but I held firm. She nodded, took a shaky breath, then turned and walked away. I watched her go, feeling an odd sense of closure. She was no longer part of my life, and I was ready to close that chapter for good. On the last day of the renovation, I stood in the front yard, looking at the house with a mix of feelings I couldn't fully describe. Grandpa and Grandma joined me, their faces filled with pride and love. They had been my pillars through everything, their unwavering support and belief in me a constant source of strength. "We did it," Grandpa said, patting my shoulder. "Your father would be proud, Ethan. You've honored him."